Hey, Ira Baptist Church and friends, I'm excited to cover this episode for you here. This one's really one, it's been in the works for a little while, at least in the stuff that our church is doing. And so I'm wanting to do an episode just kind of straight talking about the disciple making disciple groups that I announced at the member meeting last Sunday. And already, to my knowledge, have a couple that have started and are getting going. And so I want to just kind of walk through some resources, point through a few things, kind of help guide you on those and what they are, what they aren't, how you can use them, and how you can tweak them to make it fit your life and the things that you're doing and go in that way. It's also, I'm going to point out, this is probably going to be the last podcast for the year with the holidays coming up, and next week is just an odd week for me looking at my schedule that I really need to. I've got too many plates spinning with too many things coming, and so one of the things I'm going to set down for just maybe a month or so, and maybe I'll record some episodes while I can, and then have them come out at the start of the new year. Is this little podcast we're doing here? So if you have ideas or things that you'd like us to walk through and talk through as we continue working towards gospel-centered discipleship as a church, and then whoever else is interested in it, let me know. Reach out, tell me. I'd love to hear your feedback on it. I don't mind doing these, but I want them to be something that's helpful and beneficial. And so if it's not, let me know. There's no sense in doing effort and things that aren't helpful. Let's make it as best as we can for everybody. So the heart of the disciple-making disciple groups is really just the heart of discipleship within our church. And so I'm going to read a passage. It's a passage we've talked about a bunch. I'm sure you know it if you're a Christian. It's the Great Commission. And I'm going to point out just a few things before I kind of unveil the heart of the DMD groups and kind of point you in a few directions with those as you do it. This is Matthew chapter 28. We're going to start in verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. I always like to include those first two verses, verse 16 and 17. We talk about the Great Commission because there's some incredibly helpful and beneficial points there that we tend to just kind of fly over to get to the heart of the Great Commission. But don't miss what the disciples are doing. One, there's just 11 of them because Judas is gone and they haven't appointed Matthias from Acts yet. But second, they're obeying. Jesus told them, go to the mountain when I resurrect. And so they go. They do what Jesus says. And then they see all these people are there. And it's just this beautiful picture of the reality of the truth of the Scriptures, right? If the Scriptures were man-made, and simply recorded later to cover up a false claims by the disciples, right? Which is one of the things atheists and unbelievers will tell us, is the disciples just made this up later. The whole Jesus thing was way blown out of proportion. If that's the case, and they're making up the story and recording it, they would not have recorded verse 17 the way that they do. They would have said, and when they saw him, they worshipped him, and then they would move on to the Great Commission. But that's not what they do. So we see them obey Jesus, we see them worship Jesus, and you only worship God in the Bible. Every time somebody else is worshipped and it's commendable, or they're worshiping, it's uncommendable, like the angels in Revelation, where it's like, do not worship me, I am not God, or Paul and Silas on their missionary journeys. But Jesus is worshipped and he accepts that because he's God. But also, that second part's important. And some doubted. Why? Why would we can argue, why would they doubt this? You're seeing the resurrected Jesus. That's one thing. But another thing is, why recorded in the Scriptures? Well, it's recorded because it happened. This is not the disciples and the apostles and the early church tweaking the message and the events that took place with Jesus. This is them presenting the reality of what happened, that they obeyed, that a lot of them worshipped, but there were some that doubted, that didn't believe. Now look at verse 18. And then Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. He is making the claim. He is the one being worshipped. He is the one being obeyed. He has all authority. Not a little bit, not most, all of it. All authority belongs to Jesus. And so whatever Jesus says is a command that we obey because the King of the universe has given us this command. And what is it? Go, therefore, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. It's this threefold commission that's given to us. Now, in English, the first word's go, and so we tend to think of the Great Commission as going. But in reality, the imperative verb is make disciples. So that's what Jesus is saying. All authority has been given to him, and what does he tell the disciples to do? Make disciples. That you and I, if we are believers in Jesus Christ, at some point, right, we can trace back whoever told you the gospel, and then whoever told them the gospel, and whoever told them, we could trace that all the way back, and at some point it's going to land here in the Great Commission. That Jesus was standing and he told these disciples to go make disciples. Well, how do they do it? They make disciples while they're going. It doesn't mean you stop living your life and you go somewhere else like on a missionary call, although it could mean that, and that might be something the Lord is calling you to, but you need to be in tune to the Spirit with that and through the scriptures and in prayer. But in reality, what it's saying is while you are going, while you are living your life, you are supposed to make disciples. How do you make disciples? Well, we baptize. In my class on Wednesdays with the fifth graders, we're talking about the church. That's our theme for the year. And we just walked through baptism. And it's so interesting to think about baptism. And one of the questions I posed to them, and it took us a minute to sort it out, was, well, how often should we do baptism? How often should we be baptizing people? And initially their answer was, all the time, every Sunday. We should be baptizing every Sunday, which is great. That's true. Like if there are people there, but the nature of baptism is you baptize when there's new believers. But if there's no new believers, we're not baptizing. So what is he saying? As you're going and making disciples, there will be converts. And when there's converts, you baptize them. And you baptize them in the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit. And then lastly, you teach. And what are we teaching them? To obey, to observe all that he has commanded us. So we're living our lives with gospel-centered discipleship intentions, that when somebody's saved, they're being baptized, they're joining a church, that's the front door of the church, and then as a part of that church, they're being taught and trained, right? We don't just leave people once they become believers, once they're Christians, right? You don't get baptized and then all of a sudden you're spiritually mature. You have to grow. You have to progress. You have to be taught in these things. And then I love the last little verse of the sermon not the Sermon on the Mount, of the Great Commission, because it's Jesus saying, "And behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age." Well, at the very beginning of Matthew, he tells us that he's Emmanuel, which means God with us. And at the end of Matthew, he's saying, "And I'm God with you still. I'm with you till the end of the age." That's the Great Commission, and that's our call, is to make disciples, right? So we want people to be converted to the faith. We want people's souls to be saved. We want them to go from spiritual death to spiritual life. But what about after conversion? What's taking place there? That's really where these DMD groups' hearts are at. Baptists for a long time have done really, really well with missions and have struggled in the area of discipleship, or at least the Baptist churches and organizations I've been involved with have. And so what these DMD groups are, the person probably needs to be a Christian. Although if there's an unbeliever who's not a Christian, obviously, if there's somebody who's not a Christian, but they're wanting to read the scripture and do these things together, then this might be something that's good for them. You're just going to have to tweak it a little bit, because there's certain things as an unbeliever they're not going to really understand with this. So in my head and in my mind, this was geared for believers, but certainly tweak it however you need to. If there's somebody who's not a Christian and wanting to know the Bible, I mean, this is a great outline for them to walk through as well. So in theory, the rough outline for these DMD meetings is they take about an hour, but you can have that shorter, you can have that longer. It really just depends on you. For me, when I do them, it tends to be an hour, where we have about 15 minutes where we catch up on life, and then ideally we have 30 minutes to talk through whatever it is that we're centering our meetings around. So most of the ones I do are centered around reading a book or reading a book of the Bible, and we want to spend plenty of time there walking through those texts. And then the last 15 minutes tends to be prayer requests and prayer, or kind of seeing what's going on the rest of the day for the person. I mean, that's really it. I don't really want these things to be something else you're adding to your schedule, although the reality is, for discipleship, you're going to have to sacrifice something. Everybody is busy. There's millions and millions of really good things for us to be doing. But none of those other good things usurp our call to be discipled and to be disciplers. So, what these groups are trying to do is to be the best of both worlds, where I'm not adding something else for you to come to the church and come do. But what I'm saying is take your relationships that you're in and tweak them in these groups so that you can be making disciples and be being discipled, right? So that's kind of the outline of the meeting. The hope is that you'll gather 2 or 3. They don't need to be big. 2 or 3 is plenty. People's schedules are crazy, but if it's, for the most part, it's going to be 2 or 3 people who are the same gender as you. So males with males, females with females. You need to set times that you can consistently meet. So it may be, hey, I can't meet weekly. I can do every other week, or I can do once a month. All of that is fine. You just have to make sure that when you're at those meetings able to be there, that it's very consistent at them. And I get schedules are crazy. I'm in one group now, and we typically meet on Tuesdays, but pretty frequently we have to push it to Thursdays, or there's sometimes life happens and we say, hey, we just can't meet this week. And that's okay. But that's ideally. Weekly is ideal. You discuss a book. I'm working right now to get a list of books together that would be good to walk through. If you want some recommendations for some books, I'll be happy to give you some and make sure to guide you away from some rough books. There are some really bad Christian books. There's some really good ones too. And so reading a book is not a bad thing. I like to think of it as you can have really good pastors and teachers walk you through certain topics or ideas if you'll read a book together. And so that's a great way to do it. And I'm happy to walk you through those. Another one is reading the scriptures together. It's always a good thing for us to be in the Word. And I have some guidelines to kind of help us when we're reading scripture, some questions I'll show you in a minute to make sure that we're interpreting them correctly, that we're not reading too much or too little into any of them and we're taking it serious. That's a great one. Another one is maybe you're super busy and you're going, I don't have time each week or the mental energy or capacity to sit down and read a chapter or read more of the scripture. I just don't have that ability to do that. That's okay. Every week, if you're faithful in your attendance, you come to our church and you hear a sermon. And I put a lot of time and effort into those sermons because that's the primary thing God has called me to do as pastor. If I do everything else right and I get the sermons wrong, I've failed. And so one of the things you can do with these DMD groups that doesn't really add anything to your plate is just to say that the core thing we're going to talk about is last week's sermon. So we'll listen to it. If we miss, they're online. You can listen there. Or maybe you're like, hey, we hear Ben all the time. We would rather listen to somebody else. I will happily point you to some guys whose sermons you could listen to. Again, there are some really good Christian sermons and from churches out there. There's some really bad ones. So kind of let me help guide you in those. Let me help point you in the right direction. But that might be a really good thing to do of like, hey, I listened to this sermon. We're listening to it every week. Let's redeem our time by meeting up for breakfast or lunch or whatever it is. And we'll talk about the sermon. It's not a lot of prep time extra. You can just kind of devote it to that. And then you want to spend about 6 to 18 months in these groups. And that sounds odd, but my hope with these is not that you get a group and then it's just that group for the rest of your life. If we're going to be disciples who make disciples, then they have to have an expiration date on them. And so the hope is you gather together with somebody, let's say there's 2 of you, and you meet for 1 year. And then about 9 to 10 months into that meeting, you start discussing your exit plan. Okay, here's our last meeting. You go find somebody else to disciple. I'm going to find somebody else to do a DMD group with. And all of a sudden, your little group of 2 multiplied into 4. And then let's say you do the same thing again next year. And both of you commit to do it. And then the other 2 people you have, your group of 4 now grows to 8. And then 8 to 16. That's multiplication with discipleship that's taking place. And so it needs to have an end date, depending on the book you're reading or the sermons you're listening to or the book of the Bible that you're reading is going to kind of help dictate the length of those. But I do want you to have expiration dates on them, not because I don't want your relationships to be genuine, but because I want them to go further than just with one other person. And that's kind of the parameters of these. I want you to do accountability with them, and so I have some accountability questions listed that I can show you, but a lot of them are very simple. Were you in the Word and Prayer this week? Are you pursuing a non-Christian evangelistically? Did you spend quality time with your family? Like, how's your battle for sin? What is the Lord teaching you through your job, through your career? What's the Lord teaching you through your church attendance? All of those things are great things that you can be asking somebody else. As you grow closer in your relationships with one another, there might be some more pointed questions you can ask. Hey, you shared with me that you struggle to control your anger. Were you able to control your anger this week? And they can either say yes or no, and then you can be in prayer for them and walking through those with them. And so I'm going to share my screen. If you're just listening to this, this is the discipleship page at the church website, and you can see on here I'm adding to these resources weekly right now. And so I've got general Bible reading questions right here, which I covered in a lesson. These are slightly tweaked from that podcast episode, but it's the same general idea. This is a Genesis 1-pager, which is a unique resource I'm excited to share with you, which is just a summary front and back of the book of Genesis. So if that's the one you decide to read, you've got your author right here, you've got the date of Genesis, kind of the breakdown of when it took place, a bunch of the contextual details that'll help you go a little bit deeper in Genesis. If you're talking about sermons with your partner, here on the website is a sermon discussion guide where it's just some questions to kind of help push you in talking about the sermon. You're not evaluating if the sermon was good or bad. You're simply talking about what the Lord used in that sermon to grow you or challenge you or whatever it is. And then here's the DMD group guide, which I've got here, and it has your accountability questions at the bottom and kind of the basic outline of it all laid out right there. It's a great and wonderful thing that you should use, and I hope is very good and helpful for you. Lastly, I'll say this, for one of the things you can do with these groups, and they're highly flexible, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I'm going to be in charge of all of them and oversee every single little bit of it. I'm giving you general directions and trusting that if you do need help, you'll reach out and let me know. But a couple ways I guess you could use these that would be really neat to see happen is, instead of it being gender specific, if you grabbed your wives and said, we're just going to do one of these. Now, you're not going to put an end date on that one. And so maybe instead of weekly, it's monthly, where you sit down with your wife and you say, hey, let's read this book this time, or let's read this Bible passage or these scriptures, or hey, let's listen intently to the sermons and let's talk about those, or a podcast, or whatever it is that you decide to do. Man, you could do these with your spouse, or you could meet weekly, you can meet daily with your spouse. And maybe it's not necessarily you're covering a bunch of things that you're studying, but it's just, what's the Lord doing today for you? How did you grow in Him? How's your quiet time this morning? Those types of things. That would be a wonderful use of this resource to disciple your wife, to help assist and disciple your husband. You could use these for family worship, where you gather your kids around the table and just pick a time and you say, we're going to do family worship, and you can talk about the sermon, you can talk about books, you can talk about the Bible, you can do all sorts of things. You can take prayer requests of your kids and get to know your kids' hearts and be praying for them. You can sing songs together. There doesn't have to be an end to that, and it doesn't have to be daily or weekly. It can be monthly or every other, or whenever you're available. I know all of our lives are busy, but my fear is we're using that as an excuse, the busyness of our lives as an excuse, and that we're going to collectively look up in 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years and see how our kids have grown and our wives and our relationships have changed, and realized we didn't disciple like we should have. It's too important for us not to do. I'm not saying get rid of everything else. I'm just simply saying let's redeem them for the glory of the Lord, so that we can make disciples and imagine what God can do here in Ira, America, if we take this serious. That when our kids move back home in 30 or 40 years, or however long it is, they've got mature disciples, and our grandkids get to see the benefit of these types of relationships. How wonderful would that be? Hope you'll have a blessed week. Go out and make some disciples.